Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, I interviewed the writer behind a running-focused newsletter that has 800 paying subscribers. When Terrell Johnson launched on Substack, he had no intention of rolling out a paid newsletter. He was just trying to escape MailChimp's expensive fees and liked that Substack would send his newsletter for free. About a decade earlier, Terrell had created halfmarathons.net, a running-focused website that grew so popular that at one point it was generating six figures in revenue just from Google AdSense. His free newsletter served mostly as a form of marketing for the website, but he eventually began to wonder if his most engaged readers would be willing to pay for it. So he flipped on Substack's payment features, and while it wasn't an overnight success, he's gradually grown it into an impressive community of paid subscribers. I interviewed Terrell about where he got the ideas for halfmarathons.net, how he built up an audience, and why he eventually grew to distrust Google as his primary traffic driver. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about some emails that landed in my inbox recently. Rarely a week goes by without me receiving an email from someone who tells me how big a fan they are of this podcast. They usually work in communications, and they almost always mention how they used insights they gleaned from this podcast in their work. Here's the thing, this podcast carries no advertising, and I have no plans to ever run ads. The only way it becomes sustainable is if you subscribe to my Substack. If it helps you with your job, then you can probably expense it to your company, and if you're a solo practitioner, you can probably write it off as a business expense. Either way, you'd be supporting an independent creator who busts his ass each week finding the best guests and delivering their teachings to your podcast listening app. If you want to support my work, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or you can just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Subscribing gets you subscriber-only case study interviews with some of the smartest entrepreneurs and executives in the media industry. You'll also get lots of free newsletters as well. Thank you in advance for your support. Okay, on to my interview with Terrell. Hey Terrell, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you're one of the few people I've had on this podcast who never had a full-time job in media as far as I know. In fact, you work in the insurance industry, right?
Well, I did actually years before, though. I worked for the Weather Channel. So I was a journalist for the Weather Channel. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh, so you were actually like a journalist for it, but then you got into like user experience or something like that?
I did. I've kind of gone back and forth in my career. And so I was a newspaper reporter way back when I was very young. And then for small newspapers. And then for later in my career, I worked for the Weather Channel for weather.com, went to work in user experience for a couple of different agencies, and then came back to weather.com, believe it or not. And then went back to user experience. So it's kind of been a up and down, back and forth kind of journey for me.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange thing to go between those two things. Like you see journalists going between marketing and PR and back to journalism, but you don't think of UX as being kind of a journalism adjacent type field.
I know you would and you wouldn't, because you work in online journalism. It really is. It's funny. It's like the UX background has given me ways of thinking about how we use text and how we communicate stories and how we do things on social media that I might not have gotten otherwise, So
what's your history with running?
Let's see. I started running, back in my 20s. A buddy of mine, I live in Atlanta. Here in Atlanta, the big race is the Peachtree Road Race, which is a 10K race on the 4th of July every year when it's sweltering hot. But people get out, maybe 60,000 people get out in the streets of Atlanta and run it every 4th of July. And a buddy of mine was just kind of the ringleader. He's like, we're all doing this. We are doing this, and we're doing this together. And so I had really not run much before. And I was like, all right, sure, whatever. That's fine. And so we all did it. It was a blast. And
how far is the race?
What's that?
How far is the race?
Oh, 10K. Just 6.2 miles. Uh-huh. And then later after that, I met a friend who was like, why don't you try to run a marathon with me? We're going to do this fundraising thing, which was big back then. We're going to raise about $3,500, and they'll fly you to Bermuda, and they'll pay for your hotel and your airfare, and you can run a marathon. I was like, well, that sounds pretty good too. And all we have to do is actually run the marathon. And so I trained for it. And the the magic of that for me was the farthest I'd run there was a 10K, but our training plan, we trained for about 4 months, and they added just a mile a week to your long run. And it sort of expanded your sense of what was possible, what you thought you could do. Because when you start these things, you think that I'll never be able to do that.
Yeah.
And then if you expand that comfort zone very gradually every week, sooner or later, 15 miles is just no big deal. I'm just going to go out and run 15 miles today,
Yeah. I've run 2.5 marathons, and that was always, I've never had like a formal training. My strategy was always just to add one mile per week to my one long run during that week.
Yeah. I mean, we had coaches who worked with us and gave us sessions on nutrition and, how to structure a training plan and how to like sort of gradually escalate that mile in a way that's going to work for you every week. And for me to have that introduction to it in sort of a coached, structured way right at the beginning of starting running was a really neat thing.
And so I think you started a website around like 2006 or so called halfmarathons.net. Why focus on half marathons? Because you obviously you have marathons, like a lot of people do them. I've done a couple of them, but you don't think of that as the goal. You always think of the marathon as the goal, or the 5K as the goal. Why half marathons?
Well, that's a great point. It is. Nobody runs a half 10K. Nobody runs a half ultra. It is funny and a quirk of this area where it's sort of developed that way. But I read an article in 2006 in the Washington Post on Google AdSense and how people were starting to use Google AdSense to develop sites and earn money from them as side gigs or even as their full-time jobs. And I just thought to myself, I was like, I could do that. I worked at Weather Channel for weather.com. I knew HTML. I knew how to code a little bit. And I thought, I know something about running from running these marathons. And I just feel like that's just something I could do. And I looked around to see what was out there. And there was a website called marathonguide.com, but there was nothing devoted specifically to halves at the time. And the domain name was available too, because I just did some searching on that. And I'm like, well, let's just go. Let's just dig in here and see what we can do. And it wasn't really until like a few months later, I went and ran a half marathon here in Atlanta. And I noticed, because back then when you would go run a race, you would go to pick up your bib at the Race Expo, and there'd be sheets of paper with all your names and numbers and where to go. And I noticed the full marathon had like 3 or 4 sheets of paper, and the half marathon had like 15 to 20 sheets of paper up on the board of all the people who were going to participate in it. And I was like, I think I picked the right thing. From then on, that race just became the first or second most popular race in America. It was just a total, accident of luck and picking out something to design a race or design a website around. And then it just becomes really, really popular for the next decade or so.
So what was on the site? Like, what were you publishing to it?
Really, it was very simple. It was first it was just a directory. So I figured out, okay, if you want to do well in Google search results, people at that time, Google was not nearly sophisticated as it is now, and giving you events and things like that. If you were starting today, you wouldn't even do it. But back then, Google was basically just 10 blue links, and that was all your search results. So I put together just a directory of all the half marathons in America, and then eventually more around the world. And I would just figure, okay, you can't just have just the name and the date. You got to have something. So my inspiration was the book, 1,000 Things to See Before You Die. It had these great little, as you thump through the book, these great little vignettes, 5, 6 paragraphs, 7 paragraphs, that give you just sort of a feel for that place. And so I did tons of research about these races and just would write these little essays about the race. And that also was because I read this great book, SEO an Hour a Day. So that sort of self-taught SEO. And Google was looking for, at the time, really content text was food for Google, for SEO. And those descriptions, those little essays I wrote helped it do really well in the search results. And sooner or later, I had companies approach me like Active Network and Run Sign Up about, here, we want people to be able to sign up for these races from your website. And then I started creating maps of the courses, and it just became a really, really popular, just sort of clearinghouse for half marathons across the country.
And how much traffic was it getting?
At the height, and it doesn't get nearly that now, but at the height, it was getting like 500,000 unique visitors a month.
Wow. And this is just something that I've had so many people on this podcast talk about. Like, they talk about the golden age of Google, when it was like, they were like, it's people like you. They weren't trying to game it. They were doing scammy SEO. They were just producing really good content. And then it's you hear about all this antitrust stuff with Google now. Like, it's obvious that they just started. They saw all this traffic that they were sending out the door, and now I'm sure they pull stuff like information from your races and your essays and put them above the links in Google search results all the time, and it's probably siphoning away a lot of your traffic.
I mean, I always thought that about the schema.org, the structured content way of tagging content in your site so that it would be very easy for Google to then pick off and include in their own search results. And I never really did that, mainly because it's a tremendous amount of work. Mm-hmm. Because when I created my website, I also created a massive amount of work for myself over the next decade, because there were only, I would say several hundred when I started, but now there's well in advance over 2,000 of these half marathons all across the country now. And so updating them became a real challenge over time. And so I had, and still do have, a part-time person working for me who does a lot of that updating for me. And I've had a couple of freelance writers who've been fantastic and written pieces on training for me as well, and have included training programs on there. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, your original question.
No, I was just noting that, like, how common it is for people to come on this podcast and talk about how great the golden age of Google was in terms of just sending high quality traffic to sites. So were you monetizing with Google AdSense all this time? Were you branching out into other advertising and stuff like that?
Really, the only other significant one was the two companies I use. I did try other programmatic ad companies, but nothing ever came close to Google in terms of, because as obviously we see what a giant they are today. I mean, basically everyone would advertise on Google back then. So no one else could really match their pool of advertisers, which then, in the bidding process, when Google is ranking your site, they just have so many more people to compete against and get you higher per view rates and click-through rates. And per click ad rates. And so I did try other things. I was always disappointed when anyone else I would try.
And was it like throwing off good money? Because, I mean, as far as I know, you've never not had a full-time day job. You've never quit to work on this full-time. Was it a good side income at least? It
was. I mean, it made in excess of $100,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
Several years, yeah.
And so that was some nice, second home money then you were tucking away.
Right. It was the kind of thing, I actually did quit my job twice to do it. And I ended up going back to Weather Channel twice after quitting, like 6 months later. And it was because at the time it's different. My life is different now. I have a family and everything's busier, but at the time it was just myself. And then I would have these fantasies of going to quit my job and work on it and just it. But then like a month later, I would really feel the four walls sort of closing in. And so I really missed that human contact. And so I loved being part of a team. And so I never have, I feel like I've kind of got the perfect balance now, but it's still a journey.
Yeah, I mean, you're just the opposite of me. Like, I finally quit my last full-time job back in 2014.
Oh, really?
And I can't imagine. Every now and then I get like an offer to go work in some office, and I just never can bring myself to do it.
Yeah.
So how did you get into newsletters?
Well, so it was really interesting. Because it was 90% of the traffic came from Google. Easily. I mean, at the time when I started the website, Yahoo was a much bigger player in search. Ask.com was somewhat big. The other smaller search engines were still a factor, and really now they're not. But so if you occasionally, this happened like twice, But there was one day something happened where Google was showing that all of my sites, the links to my site were dangerous to visit, and traffic just plummeted. And so I submitted these things to Google of like, hey, really everything is okay. And 24 hours later, it was fine. But I was like, that was an aha moment of like, they really control your destiny. If they send you down in the rankings, or if they decide that for whatever reason, you're not a suitable person or suitable place to send traffic to, you're done. And so right around this time, this is like 2013, 2014, I was just giving a lot of thought to it. And there was another day that like the servers just crashed and the site was just down. Nothing about dangerous links or anything like that. It's just like, it was just down. Getting on the phone with a web hosting company, everything was fine later, but those two incidents left huge impression. So at the time, the Skim, that email newsletter, was really becoming a big thing. And it started, and of course we all know about email newsletters, but that was they were leading a renaissance in terms of bringing lots of attention to the email newsletter again. And so I started subscribing and following what they were doing. And I was like, this is genius. They do not have to follow a Facebook algorithm. They do not have to follow a Google algorithm. They have a direct relationship with each and every one of their readers. They go right into their inbox every morning. I'm like, you just can't beat that. There's nothing better than having a direct relationship with your audience. So I developed an email newsletter purely for the purposes of promoting the website. And so I would include like a selection of, these are just great races. These are like 10 races at the beach, 10 races that are really walker friendly, 10 races that are really flat where you can get a PR, which is a personal record time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so on. And over time, I think one of the first, like we talked about, one of the first things I really wrote, I started writing these very brief little intros, and they sort of become bigger over time. And one of the first ones I wrote about was the introduction of the Apple Watch and what this might do for health and what this might do for athletic performance. And the response I started getting back from people was really just moving and just gratifying, and just was kind of blown away by the response from readers. So I just kind of kept doing it. And I just kind of developed this relationship with the readers over time. And so that just kind of it was originally just purely a promotional vehicle for the website that became something else on its own.
And most of the signups were just because you had like a sign up form on right on the right-hand sidebar, right?
That's right.
But you got like pretty good sign up numbers because you were using MailChimp, right? And you said that you've told me that you were paying hundreds of dollars a month, and I know based on pricing, that means you had, possibly like tens of thousands of subscribers, right?
Yeah, I mean, the list got up to well over 50,000 subscribers. And yeah, when you get into those kind of numbers, you're paying MailChimp. I was paying, I think at the height of around $250 a month, something like that. And so I was using, I was thinking to myself, okay, this is costing, what really started as just sort of an interesting little venture is now starting to cost some serious money. And as I continue to add more readers, it will just continue to cost more money. And I experimented with some advertising, like sending out what they call dedicated emails that would just be, selling those to an advertiser. The entire email is just an ad rather than just sort of an ad within your newsletter. And also,
I would hate doing that because if people are sending that to spam or whatever, like that's just going to erode, the trust in your newsletter. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, completely.
Because like you're basically handing your brand over to someone else.
Exactly. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who completely abuse it. So, but I really did it I tried to really make it just for advertisers that were relevant to the audience. So it would just really just be for big time marathons that had bigger advertising budgets. I would do things for them. I wouldn't go and advertise products and services that were not relevant to them. I'm not going to advertise hot sauce to them, So, but then I happened to notice one day I got this newsletter by Caroline Crampton, who some of your audience may know. She used to write this every week, a newsletter called No Complaints. And she started a paid newsletter because she was really into podcasts. And I think it was called Podmail. And I just wrote her back and I was like, what is this? What are you doing here? And I got an email back from Hamish McKenzie at Substack. And that was the company that she had gone with. She must have been one of the earliest Substack paid newsletters, because this was around 2018, I guess, early 2018. Mm-hmm. And so I get to talking to Hamish McKenzie, and I just talk email back and forth for the next month. We talk on the phone a couple of times, and he's telling me all about Substack. And the company was very early. I think they just started maybe the year before then. But it was still very early days for them. And he put me on the phone with Bill Bishop from Cynicism. And that really helped convince me, okay, this is really interesting. What they're doing is really interesting. You don't have to pay. I wouldn't have to pay MailChimp's fees anymore if I moved over to Substack. So I was like, win there,
Yeah, so you went from $250 a month to $0
exactly. So I'd already saved $3,000 a year right off the bat.
And what about, so like it like Substack doesn't have the same functionality as a more robust MailChimp. Did you miss any of that?
No, I mean, because what I'm doing is really an editorial newsletter. And at the time when I was with MailChimp, that was still a big thing for them, because you wrote about it in your newsletter this morning. Tiny letter, they had the acronym Tiny letter. And that was still part, I think over time, they've definitely moved to more of like, we are a marketing company for small and mid-sized businesses and large businesses too. But, they focus on the small and mid-sized businesses. And, because at one time their phrase was, or their tagline was, send better email. And to be honest, it escapes me at the moment what it is, but the email is no longer in that. I mean, they're sort of a full service marketing firm across email, social media, Google ads, Instagram ads, everything for you now. So that's not really their focus anymore.
Yeah, they never realized that a lot of people just want to send a very basic newsletter. So like they never built out a cheaper or less expensive version that just did very basic stuff like what Substack is doing.
Yeah. And I understand go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was going to say they had a product that did that tiny letter, but as I wrote in my newsletter today, they really just kind of let that die on the vine.
Yeah, and they were going to sort of absorb it into MailChimp or make it a part of MailChimp, but that hasn't happened to my knowledge. So, and I've really wondered why as well, and so I don't really know.
So, so eventually you launched a paid version of the Substack newsletter. What was going on? What was your thinking there?
My thinking there was, this would just be a really interesting way to, it was just purely an experiment. I mean, everything I've done with this whole thing the whole time is an experiment. Week by week, it's an experiment. And my thinking at the time was, I'll offer more, because I remember I was a big fan of what Ben Thompson had done at Stratechery, and I'm sure many of your audience is well aware of. And I wanted to be able to give the audience more, because I would have this great relationship with them. We'd write back and forth, we'd email back and forth, but I really only had this once a week, send to them on Wednesday afternoons. And so I thought this would be a really cool way to dig deeper. And so, and honestly, I didn't have probably the greatest plan at the time, and it's really changed since then, to be honest with you too. So what it became for a while was, I'll give you more races. And, so I just kept investigating and looking for more races and coming up with these specialized race lists. But right now, because of coronavirus, most races in America, 90+% are on hold. And, they do have some that are still scheduled, but most are canceled, except for the smaller ones. But so go ahead.
Oh, well, it's just like, it's interesting what you're saying. Like your first inclination was just to offer more. I had a guest on it hasn't run yet as when we're speaking, but by the time people hear this episode, we'll already run this guy named Josh Spector, who specializes in newsletters. And we kind of talked about that, is that, when designing a paid newsletter, your natural inclination is just going to offer more of what you're already offering from the free version, but is that enough to entice people who are already just satisfied with the free version? So he kind of advised, and this is something that I've definitely taken and I've started to kind of change with my newsletter paid offering, is like, can you offer something different? So how did that evolve for you?
Well, it's great because I love Josh. I'm a client of his. When he and I worked together earlier this year, and he's given me a lot of great advice on exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so it's funny because the coronavirus, I was really sort of just providing just information before. And I feel like there's a really great video that's gone around, probably made the rounds on Twitter the past several years, but it's this interview he gave in 1999. And it's about the impact of the internet with an interview with the BBC. And he talks about the interview with the BBC is like, this is just sort of a new format, right? He's like, no, it's like an alien that's landed on Earth and it's changed everything. And it's no longer just the artist in the music anymore. It's the audience is now a participant in the whole creation and exchange and, everything. And so the coronavirus, because no one's doing races anymore, or at least they're on hold for a while, has forced me to sort of do something that's more participatory with the audience, which has been converted into more of like a virtual running group, which has been a blast. And so we're all training together now for a virtual race. And I sort of coach them, and we're working together on a training plan. And, the people who are now paid subscribers are sort of, we're like one of the things that was so much fun to me about running years ago was being part of a running group. And it was for years. And we would meet every Saturday morning in Atlanta. We'd meet for coffee afterwards. And for various reasons, one person got divorced, one person moved away, the running group kind of split up. And so my newsletter is kind of a way of reassembling a virtual running group for myself, except we don't meet personally. We're not meeting together in person for running and coffee. We're all across the country and all across the world. But we just kind of check in with each other after a run, either every day or on the weekends. And it's really become something different.
So it's like something where you send them on Tuesday morning or whatever time. Like today, you're going to run intervals where you're going to run hard for 1 minute and then jog for 10 minutes, like something like that, where you're like giving them detailed instructions of how to run.
Exactly. We're just running mileage right now. So we're not really running lots of drills, but we are this kind of thing. I do want to introduce more of that and more like challenges, because that's become a big thing as during all this time when we can't really do races, is how do you keep yourself motivated and how do you keep yourself out there doing it? And so a lot of these challenges of like run across Tennessee where you're really running the equivalent of the mileage, or run the Appalachian Trail, and you track yourself in an app and things like that. We won't have an app because we're on Substack, but I can see that becoming more part of what we do.
And do you provide a way for your subscribers to interact with each other?
Yeah, we do. And that has been, I think the most effective way has been for us in just the comments and back and forth over email. Because my audience is all ages. I mean, it's some people in their 20s, some people 30s, but probably more heavily tilted towards 40s, 50s, 60s. And so they're not, with the exception of maybe Facebook groups, they're not, I have tried things like a Slack app, or a Slack channel rather. But getting people to download an extra app is a real hurdle.
Yeah, that's why a lot of people turn to Facebook groups, is because it's just like everybody's logging into Facebook anyway. So like, why not just put it where they're most likely to be? But then, then you're handing over a lot of power to Facebook, and the algorithm could start burying your posts. So it's definitely something you have to weigh in your head. So you say they interact in the comments. So Substack, if you click through to the article version of the news of each newsletter, there's actually a comment site on the website. So you're saying they're going into that and they're kind of chatting with each other,
right? And Substack does it. So, I mean, it's genius. You can do two different ways. There's the comments on the articles, and there's also discussion threads, which is just basically a question, and then just people jump in for a live chat. And that in and of itself isn't innovative necessarily, in the sense that, well, we've been doing that on Reddit or message boards or whatever for 20 years. But it's really great because you do it and people get an email alert when there's been a reply or a like to their comment. And so then they can go back, and they don't have to download another app. They don't have to be connected to any sort of social network. It's just email, but they can go back and still participate in the conversation. And it's great because they have this live feel to them. And you're really talking in real time with all the people who you're connected with on this particular Substack. And it's really fun. It's been one of the most fun parts of doing the newsletter, actually. Probably maybe the most fun.
Yeah. So like so they have like this message board feature called like Threads. And I'm just kind of regurgitating for people who don't use Substack. It's almost like a message board. You could just post a single question. So it's not like an article or a newsletter, and they can follow the link, and then it's basically, you can set the discussion topic, and then it's like a kind of like almost like an old school message board. I see looking through kind of you have a lot of comments on each post. You spend a lot of time like replying to people, as they write. Like
I do.
Like, is that like a huge time commitment to you each week? Is just responding to people?
I wouldn't say it's a huge time commitment. It probably, if I added it all up, it might be. But I mean, it's important to me because I want them to feel like they really are interacting with me, and they are. I mean, it's me. It's not anybody else answering these things. It's me. Because I think that makes it feel more of a human connection. And you're talking to a real person, and you're really talking to the writer of this newsletter. And I just enjoy it. I enjoy hearing from them. I enjoy when I get emails from them. It's immensely gratifying to have your work resonate with your audience, and that they're taking the time to reply to me. They don't have to do this, I mean, they got busy days too. They got families, they got children, they got jobs, but they're taking time out of their day to reply to. Yeah, I feel like it's the least I can do to reply back.
How did you price the paid version?
At the time I did it, it was very much it was like, this is kind of what Substack was suggesting. And that was what a lot of the more, I'm a B2C as opposed to a B2B. I don't feel like it's reasonable for me to charge $100 a year or $10 a month for what I'm offering, because it's not specialized business knowledge, and also I kind of feel good about the price where I am, because Runner's World, which we're not, anyway competing with, to be sure, but they offer now a paid version that is basically the same price. And I figured, okay, so that's probably the right price.
Which is?
Theirs is $50 a year or $5 a month, and mine's $49 a year or $5 a month.
And so, how did you promote it? How did you announce the paid version, and how do you continue to try to funnel people into the paid version today?
That is great. At the beginning, I made an announcement, and I sort of outlined, here's what we're doing. We're moving to this paid version, and here's why. And the reason is because over that 6 months to a year, well, I guess I'd been doing it for about 3 years at that point, totally for free. Had made money from the advertisements I'd run in it, but other than that, hadn't made any money from it. And I felt like, there's only so long that I can do this and continue to pay MailChimp or whatever email service provider thousands of dollars a year to do this. At some point, it needs to provide a return. So, and because I also wanted to include other writers in there, I needed to earn money from it to pay other writers for their work, which I've done. And I've got two great writers that I love working with right now, Holly Sick and Carissa Leibowitz, which would be familiar to anybody who's read the newsletter. But I just made that announcement. I said, this is really, a community has grown around this. I want to continue to do this for, as long as I can. And I would just love it if you would be willing to contribute to that. And so I was really pleasantly surprised. I was pleasantly surprised that anyone would pay. I didn't know if anyone would. And a number of people did that day. Several dozen did.
Yeah. So would you say that a lot of your current subscribers came during that, shortly after that initial announcement? Or?
Yeah. The first, when you go turn to a paid subscription, as you know, your biggest batch of people is going to be that first day, that initial launch. And I continue to do things like I would do occasional discounts on 4th of July or New Year's Eve, because just from running the website as well over the years, New Year's is like a big time. Everyone's making New Year's resolutions. Everyone's thinking about, the way they want to transform in the coming year. And obviously a lot of that's around losing weight or feeling better or feeling healthy. And so that's what a lot of people, it's interesting to watch my analytics from on the old website, when basically through December, the traffic would always just gradually decrease from the first through about the 27th or the 28th. And then on the 29th, 30th, and 31st, it would just shoot up every single year. So I try to time my promotions around that when I think people are thinking about this. And generally it's emails out to the free audience. What I'm trying to do now through working with Josh is to do more of developing a relationship with people through social media so they can just get acquainted with what the newsletter is about, which I did some of this summer. Just when we first went we were first all working from home during the coronavirus. I did kind of a training group through our Instagram account. And I was just blown away by the response and the engagement I got through that. It was really fun to sort of check in with people every day, ask them how their running was going. They would tell me, they would send me their photos. I would put them in Instagram stories. And as cynical as we've all gotten about social media over the past several years, since what happened with the Russians in 2016, I've sort of had my faith restored in a way about the power of social media from all that's been happening during this coronavirus period. So it's this, and what Josh has helped me see is this, what an amazing channel it is for reaching audiences you haven't, because sooner or later with your email audience, you're going to reach diminishing returns in trying to promote it. Like at a certain point, you're going to cause I've been doing this a little over 2 years now. And if certain people haven't responded to discount offers or within 2 years, they're probably not going to. So that's where I'm looking now. And that's an area where I'm just beginning to scratch the surface.
Is like finding people outside of the newsletter.
It's more like trying to give them, treating Twitter and Instagram is a place where they can window shop and they can sort of sample you and see what you're like, and to give them a feel for what you're like and sort of interact with people there, but not push it necessarily.
Yeah.
If that makes sense,
It's kind of what I'm trying to do with Facebook group. Like I have like a private Facebook group that I only link to from my newsletter. So the vast majority of people are in there are newsletter subscribers. And so I'm trying to like put a little bit of extra effort into always making sure to respond and be a little bit more interactive in the Facebook group than in other places. It's not perfect. Like if someone responds with something and I just have nothing good to add, so I might just like their comment or whatever. But you do that kind of to like foster a little bit closer connection that hopefully might lead to a paid conversion at some point.
Yeah. I think I can't prove this, but I feel like I've gotten at least a couple of paid subscriptions from interacting with people over Instagram. And for me, just my particular audience and my topic area, that seems to work really well. Maybe it's just total coincidence, but I was just noticing that, I do this on Instagram and I get these people coming over and checking us out. So, and it's also fun, and it is, though, can be overwhelming because there can be so much engagement coming in. There's only 24 hours in a day, and there's only 7 days in a week, and you can only do so much.
And so how, you said you've been running the paid version for like 2 years now. How ultimately how successful has it been?
So right now, you're looking for like numbers, like
sure, if you can offer them.
Yeah, if you're looking for numbers, yeah. I've got a little over 800 paid subscribers and a little over 50,000 on the free list. So if you were looking at that, you would think, you're not doing so great. But the email list is a little over 5.5 years old now. I get about 22 to 25% open rates on the free list. And so I'm thinking that's
10,000.
That's 10 to 15, 10 to 14,000 people per week are opening it. So I feel like that's pretty good.
Yeah, so you've converted 10% of the people who are regularly opening it.
Yeah. And something I read recently, because every single person who decides they don't want to continue as a paid subscriber, I take completely as a punch in the stomach. Yeah. It is hard to take. And it hurts.
And I launched my paid newsletter 6 months ago, and I'm now starting to experience my first churn, and it sucks, like seeing someone unsubscribe.
It does. It does. But what I'm trying to remember is, and I saw somebody say this on Twitter the other day, and Ben Thompson has said this as well. It's like when people leave, you have to let them go. Because if it's not right for them, it's not right for them. And you got to focus on the people who love what you're doing. And that's what I'm trying to remember. And there are people who love what I'm doing. And I'm sure there's people who love what you're doing. And focus on what you're doing right with them. And there's another thing Ben Thompson has always said, and I'm quoting him a lot, but is the internet is a lot bigger than you think it is. Mm-hmm. And there are all different kinds of people out there who would love what you do, but just don't know about
it. They just don't know you even exist.
Yeah. And so I think about my email list and how many times I've sent out to them over the years just from running the newsletter. And I think, but I haven't really, until talking with Josh earlier this year, I haven't really used social media other than just to post silly memes here and there that much. I haven't used it in a focused, targeted, strategic way. And if I did, there's this gigantic audience I've never even known or come across, and they don't, they've never been acquainted with you.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, Terrell, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find your work online?
It is halfmarathons.substack.com or halfmarathons.net.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was great. Great talking to you.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast. So if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.